The Associated Press claimed the DoJ secretly seized 2 months' worth of telephone records from its reporters and editors. The president of the AP filing a letter of protest. He wrote to Attorney General Eric Holder, "This action was taken without advance notice to AP or to any of the affected journalists. And even after the fact, no notice has been sent to individual journalists whose home phones and cell phone records were seized by the department. There can be no possible justification for such an overbroad collection of the telephone communications of the Associated Press and its reporters." White House Press Secretary Jay Carney responded to questions about this, saying, quote, "Other than press reports, we have no knowledge of any attempt by the Justice Department to seek phone records of the AP. We are not involved in decisions made in connection with criminal investigations, as those matters are handled independently by the Justice Department. Any questions about an ongoing criminal investigation should be directed to the Department of Justice." Our Newswatch panel now with a very unique perspective on all this. Judith Miller is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, author, and Fox News contributor. You might recall she had her own fight when the government demanded information on her sources during the CIA leak case. Marvin Kalb is a former network correspondent for more than 3 decades, also a Fox News contributor, and he was personally wiretapped during the Nixon administration. It's great to have you both here on this very important story. Marvin, is the Department of Justice crossing a line here?
Absolutely. There's no question in my mind that the U.S. government has an obligation or responsibility to look into leaks to try to protect the national interest. But there are ways that you do this. When the government crosses a line, as it has done this time, it hinders its own ability to get at the truth. It loses the respect of the press. It loses the respect of the American people. The Justice Department made a big boo-boo.
Judy, George Will had an interesting column out today. We are awaiting the news briefing from Jay Carney, expected to begin any minute now, although it is also expected to be late. But here's what George Will had to say. He said, "Jay Carney, whose unenviable job is to explain away what his employers say, calls the IRS behavior inappropriate. No, using the salad fork for the entree is inappropriate. Using the IRS for political purposes is a criminal offense." And I'm sorry I've jumped to the IRS scandal. It's sometimes a little hard to keep these straight in a week like this. But let's talk about that one.
Well, look, I think what we have here, and this is the problem, is beginning to be a pattern of misuse of government power. You have it with respect to the IRS case, and you have it with respect to the AP. Let me just walk you through a little bit about what's supposed to happen when the government wants to know who leaked information and a news organization is involved. What happens is that the government goes to that news organization and says, "We think that your reporters got some of this information. We want your telephone records," and then you begin a judicial proceeding. That's not what happened in this case. In this case, the government just seized the records, and because it has to tell the news organization within 90 days that it's done that, it finally did that on Friday. This is not the way you proceed if you're not going to develop, if you don't care about developing any relationship of confidence with the press. And since the press has bent over backwards to be nice to this administration, it seems to me that it's the least they could have done to do the same with the AP.
We have so much more to talk about regarding all of this, and there is breaking news. We just learned that the Attorney General has recused himself from the leak investigation related to the Associated Press. He will announce as much at the Department of Justice presser, which is expected to start about 30 minutes from now. And apparently it's because he did testify. He was interviewed when they were first looking for answers as to who leaked this information. I just want to get your thoughts on his recusal here.
Well, on the recusal itself, I can't offer any terrific insight. I don't know. Let's wait and see what he says. But on the overall issue, I think let's not lose sight of the fact that both sides, I mean the media and the government, have clear responsibilities in the coverage of this story and what is happening. The media has the responsibility to report the news. It's going to go where it can to get the news. It's going to talk to as many people as possible. The Justice Department has to be very careful when it goes after the media that it's not crossing an unacceptable line that only frustrates their own efforts. What is essential here is that this has happened before. It happened to me during the Nixon times. It happened to Judy in another administration, and it is happening right now. In all of these cases, the government has gone too far because it's up against the wall, because it feels frightened by some external threat. With me, it was the Vietnam War. With Judy, it was international terrorism. This goes on, but the government cannot go where it shouldn't go. And in this particular case, it went too far.
The president has said that this is all political, that this is, his, I guess, political enemies trying to make hay out of mistakes or problems within his administration. Perhaps it is no surprise that Reince Priebus, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, just issued a call for the Attorney General to resign. He says, quote, "Because Attorney General Holder has so egregiously violated the public trust, the president should ask for his immediate resignation. If President Obama does not, the message will be unmistakable. The President of the United States believes his administration is above the Constitution and does not respect the role of a free press." I want to ask you about that, Judy, because we just read that statement at the beginning of this segment from Jay Carney, who again is about to speak. Jay Carney says, oh, this was something that the Justice Department did, subpoenaing the AP telephone records. We at the White House had no knowledge of it. Eric Holder and President Obama are about as tight as you can get in Washington, aren't they?
Exactly, and I just find Jay Carney's sudden ignorance extremely convenient. It seems to me when you have over 100 journalists' records being seized without notice, you owe the country an explanation, and I just can't wait to see how he's going to get out of this one.
Does it make sense, Marvin? I mean, does it pass the smell test that the Justice Department would be subpoenaing these records on this story that was, favorable to the White House, frankly, talked about how the White House was on top of terrorism in northern Africa, and the White House would know nothing about it?
No, that part of it doesn't sit very well with me either. But we have to be mindful of the fact that the government has a primary responsibility to defend this country, in this particular case, against the threat of global terrorism. We have to remember that last year, the New York Times was reporting a story about Stuxnet, which is a technological virus that they were trying to put into the Iranian nuclear program. And that was a program developed by, the Stuxnet was developed by the U.S. and Israel. At that time, the New York Times found out about it, and the government was trying to find out how the New York Times found out about it. Right now, the government is absorbed in the same kind of an issue. The threat is the same, it's global terrorism, but how you respond to it is different. There is the similarity, however, that the media, because we're all so out there and in front, is the easiest one to get. And so if you're scapegoating, if you need somebody to accuse of something wrong, you go after the media. But we've got to be careful. This is not as yet proven that the government went after the AP. The government went where it shouldn't go, and the files happened to be with the AP. That was a very foolish move on its part.
Well, and then there's this, Judy. I mean, during the Bush administration, President Bush and Vice President Cheney were responsible for everything, the conduct of the Iraq War and waterboarding and everything else. This administration doesn't seem to be responsible, or isn't being held responsible for many of these erupting scandals.
Exactly. The president is outraged by the IRS scandal, even though it now appears that supervisors of the people who targeted conservatives were aware that that was being done. He says he dismisses Benghazi as a sideshow in politics, even though his own White House spokesman went out and misled the American people. We don't know yet whether or not that was conscious or inadvertent. That's one of the many questions that has to be determined. Now we have the government going to the Associated Press, rather than doing its own investigation, The law requires the government to exhaust all other means before it goes to the reporters and news organizations and demands these kinds of records. There's no indication as yet that the government has, quote, exhausted all of the alternatives. So I go back, John, to this notion of kind of just a power that is being systematically abused by the government without the White House having any indication that it's going on. I'm sorry, I agree with Marvin. It does not pass the smell test.
Judy, we know you were up late working on your piece about all of this, and we appreciate you coming in to share your thoughts with us live here at the noon hour on the East Coast. Judy Miller, Marvin Kalb.
My pleasure, John.
Both Fox News contributors. Thank you both, and we are continuing to await that briefing from Jay Carney, the man whose job I definitely wouldn't want to have today. Thank you.